All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another session of our International Symposium. This session, Research for the UN Sustainable Development Goals, will be taking place for the next 50 minutes. I'd like to introduce our presenters to you, Patrick Keyes, who's lead scientist in the School of Global Environmental Sustainability, Kathleen Galvin, who is professor of anthropology and director of the Africa Center, Reka Warrior, postdoctoral fellow for the School of Global, goodness, this morning, SOJAS, the School of Global Environmental Sustainability. I'm very excited to have this session. We've got a Q&A box enabled as well as chat, so please feel free to participate that way. And we also have a short link to a survey after the session ends at 11:50. And with that, I'll turn it over to our panelists for what I'm sure will be an excellent and compelling session. Thank you so much for attending.
Okay, so I'm just going to do a brief introduction again. My name is Pat Keyes, and I want to give a little bit of a background just on this session, what we'll be presenting. And the three panelists are Kathy Galvin, Reka Warrior, and myself. And we're all going to be speaking about different work that we've been doing to try and work towards the Sustainable Development Goals, these set of 17 interconnected sustainable and development goals broadly internationally. So this could be everything from reducing poverty to eradicating hunger, moving towards greater gender equality, all the way towards improving biodiversity conservation and climate action. And so the set of 17 interconnected goals is nominally aimed to be achieved by 2030. And there's regular progress reports that countries give along the way. And in this session, what we're hoping to do is just provide, honestly, kind of a snapshot of some work that we've been doing individually with other collaborators, as well as collectively among the three of us. And so with that, I would just like to give the floor to Kathy. If you can go ahead and share your screen.
Okay, well, thank you, Pat. Can everyone see my screen? Hello?
Yes, looks good.
Thank you. So as Pat said, my name is Kathy Galvin, and I'm going to be talking today, looking at different scales of addressing the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And my title is Engagement for Advancing the SDGs in the African Drylands where I work. Now, as Pat just mentioned, there are 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm going to focus on number 15, Life on Land. And I will show you here, the SDG 15 Life on Land states that it to protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably manage forests, combat desertification, and halt and reverse land degradation and halt biodiversity loss. And I want to make the point that this is very basic to everything that everything else in the Sustainable Development Goals. It sits in the bottom here at the natural resource base. This is number 15, though you can't see it. And this is really central to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals that have to do with sort of higher order, more social kinds of goals, including production and consumption and human well-being. But as Bob Watson tells us, we're not necessarily achieving them. Environmental degradation threatens the achievement of the SDGs. And then there's a number of issues associated, damages from climate-related natural disasters to 3.2 billion people affected by land degradation and pollution. And for Africa, though this is a bit old, it's a 2018, it's part of the IPBES global assessment and how the Africa is progressing towards achieving the SDGs. And really, the bottom line, the last sentence is the one that's important here, is that even though we have all of these frameworks, they've emerged as an incentive opportunity for Africa, although there's no information on progress. So we're not actually very close to achieving these goals. But in 2015, a number of about 600 indigenous peoples gathered in Paris just before the IPCC agreement was signed by Barack Obama. And they basically said, we are living with environmental changes, climate changes, and we are need to be part of the solution. And then the IPBES group has actually written a report on the biodiversity and ecosystem services, but from the particular relevance to indigenous peoples and local communities. And there are a couple of key messages that I just want to bring out associated with that report. And that is that at least a quarter of the global land area is traditionally owned and managed by indigenous peoples. Nature is generally declining less rapidly in indigenous peoples' lands. And the lands of indigenous peoples are becoming islands of biological and cultural diversity. One more key message in that is that indigenous peoples and local communities have been proactively confronting such challenges in partnership with each other and with an array of other stakeholders. So I would like to bring us to a particular place where I've spent decades working in East Africa. And in particular, looking at East Africa and Kenya in particular. Kenya, for instance, is approximately 80% dry lands, and there are large number or high percentage of dry lands in Ethiopia and some in Tanzania as well. And in the dry lands of East Africa exists most of the wildlife, but also pastoral peoples who herd camels, cattle, sheep, goats, donkeys. But there's been tremendous changes in these rangelands, from changes in different livestock species to agricultural changes to towns being growing up, huge influences from the West, including Christianity. In the meantime, people are trying to live with wildlife in their places, but we have climate variability increasing with out of season rains, for instance, and of course, droughts. So there's been tremendous changes that have occurring that actually fragments these landscapes into these once intact landscapes are becoming isolated, associated with these changes and making it much more difficult for people, their livestock and wildlife to move through that landscape. So a few years ago, we brought a number of pastoralists together from Kenya, from 4 different counties, Turkana, Garissa, Narok, and Kajiado. They're all different ethnic groups to come together to talk about what were the environmental changes that were occurring and what were some of the solutions from their viewpoints that needed to be addressed. So this is a very complex but sort of complete look at what people were saying over those 2 years in terms of what are the drivers and consequences across scales of these changes, all the way from community to local, regional, and national. And it was very, very clear to us that these local peoples living in their places actually understood the scale, the scale effect, the scale effect of some of these changes. And they had a very nuanced and complex understanding of what was going on the ground, but also all the way up to the global level. And so they talked about a number of solutions to these changes that were occurring in their places. And some of them had to do with improving pastoralism, transforming it, and even abandoning pastoralism under these changes. And I can tell you that nobody wanted to actually go to abandoning pastoralism, but they actually did consider this as an alternative. So in sum, I would like to sort of make the point that, you know, we have these science policy initiatives like the SDGs, the IPBES, which is the Biodiversity Ecosystem Services, and even the CBD at these global scales. And yet NGOs and lots of people are working at the sort of mesoscale from the local, but to the national and even to the global. But where people sit is the indigenous peoples and local communities at the local level. And the question is, how do we link what is being said at the global level to the local level and vice versa? So these global agreements often, and they always, lead to these national level policies that provide internationally agreed upon norms that lead to implementation, but they're often sort of one size fits all. And we really need actions that are sensitive to local priorities, yet comparable and useful beyond the local. And one way of doing this is through multi-level networks and collaborative relationships of state, civil society, and citizens group to move towards common goals that can bridge that gap between the SDGs and what's really going on at the local level. And with that, I just say thank you.
Great, thank you, Kathy. Reka, would you be able to go next and share your screen?
Yep. All right. Thanks, Kathy. And can everybody see my screen here?
Yes, looks great.
Okay, great. So hello, everyone, and thanks again for being here. Today, I'm just going to briefly talk about a preliminary exploration that we've done regarding afforestation options for Kenya, and also exploring how durable these options might be under diverse future scenarios. So under both SDG 15, as well as a policy called Kenya Vision 2030, the Kenyan government has pledged to increase forest cover in Kenya by up to 10% by 2030. And the current forest cover extent is about 6% across the country. And with this sort of pledge, a question has come up about where these afforestation efforts should be focused across Kenya to achieve this goal. So now we know that forests are increasingly being recognized as an important nature-based solution for mitigating climate change. But what is also true is that these forests are extremely vulnerable to climate change themselves. And this vulnerability, regime shifts or changes in community composition, forest tiebacks, or vulnerability to disasters such as forest fires. And more importantly, these forests may also be vulnerable to indirect effects of climate change that may manifest through climate effects on society, such as the rates at which urbanization change, or how dependent rural populations become on forest produce, for example. So with that in mind, the question really becomes about what sort of measures can be taken in the present so that afforestation efforts are resilient, in that the trees that we plant today persist into this future time period under these diverse scenarios of climate and socio-economic realities. So some of the questions that are of interest would be, where should new forests be planted or restored? What kinds of species should potentially be planted? And more importantly, how should these areas be protected? So to answer some of these questions, we need to have a sense of what the future can look like in the future. So what the world can look like in the future. And some of these glimpses are provided by the shared socioeconomic pathways, which provide us with storylines of how the world might develop. So for example, the diverse SSPs such as SSP 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 tell us about, will the world develop sustainably? Is it going to be a fossil? Impacts on population, education, urbanization, etc., can be roughly predicted. And along with the representative concentration pathways, we can also make predictions about what future climatic conditions will look like under these diverse storylines of future development. So for Kenya, we were interested in understanding, in order to target specific afforestation efforts, it would be useful to know how existing forested areas would behave in the future. Like, how will future climate change impact the current areas that have forests on them in Kenya? And to do this, what we did was use a simulation model called L-range. L-range is a localized version of a global rangelands model called G-range. And what that model does is essentially simulate plant populations, populations of trees, shrubs, and herbs, as well as biogeochemical cycling processes along monthly time steps in response to changing climatic conditions in those months. And there are a number of input variables that go into it, such as soil composition, vegetation distribution. It's pretty comprehensive, and I can get to it later during a question and answer session. But we used L-range, and within L-range, the main unit over which plant populations and biogeochemical cycling is simulated are these sort of rangeland units, different sort of potential vegetation regions in Kenya. And for each of these sort of vegetation classes, like tropical evergreen forest, deciduous forest, savanna, there are specific sets of parameters that control or determine different ecosystem function processes. And the output variables that we get at the end of each month are, how have specific plant populations, such as populations of trees, shrubs, or herbs within each of these patches, how have they changed at the end of each month? Similarly, it also measures other ecosystem variables such as soil carbon sequestration, surface runoff, soil nitrogen, etc. So what we first did was identify areas that currently have forests in Kenya. And to do this, we used a very comprehensive land cover data set called AfriCover. So here is for Kenya, each of these polygons basically show what the dominant land cover type is. Is it a tree dominated area? What is the understory like? Or is it an agricultural area? What is the dominant crop? So that's what each of these several polygons demarcate. And for using that information, we first identified areas that are currently recognized as dominated by tree cover, natural tree cover in Kenya. So that is the subset of those polygons, which are these green areas that you see on the map here. And so these include areas such as broadleaf deciduous forests, woodlands, and shrub with shrubs, multi-layered broadleaf evergreen forests, and other such areas. Now, an important input that goes L range is the distribution of deciduous and evergreen cover. So here this map shows the distribution of deciduous forests and evergreen forests across Kenya. And this is overlaid by the polygons that basically demarcate the forest cover areas in the region. And this is a data set called the 1 kilometer consensus land cover data set that we use to demarcate these evergreen and deciduous forest extents. And finally, we selected 2 future scenarios. One is SSP1 that basically outlines a sustainability scenario, a very optimistic world where the world progresses along with high levels of sustainable development. There's high emphasis on well-being, whereas the SSP2 is a scenario where there's sort of middle of the road development, existing patterns of development continue. Growth is somewhat iniquitous, and there is higher population growth as well. And in order to sort of explore these scenarios, we brought together appropriate data sets that represent these scenarios as the climate change data, which includes what temperature and precipitation trends in the future under these SSP1 and SSP2 scenarios, as well as water population and urbanization trends across Kenya under these 2 futures. And so we brought all these data together and conducted 3 separate L range simulations. One was for the historical period of 1980 through 2014 to set a baseline for what environmental conditions are like and what the condition of tree cover is like across Kenya. And then 2 simulations for a future period, so 2020 through 2100 under SSP1 and the same period under SSP2. And at the end of each of these simulations, we tallied the change in tree cover extent that was evident within those forest cover polygons that I had outlined initially. So in each of those polygons, what is the forest cover in 2050 under SSP1 relative to the forest cover in the historical period, which is in 2014. So did it increase, did it decline, or did it stay the same? So here is a plot that shows the simulation results from SSP1. And what we see here, these green areas are basically forest cover areas where the existing tree cover within them remain the same or did not change at the end of 2050. And the gray areas are where there were losses were evident. So you can see here that even under the sustainability scenario, there are significant areas of losses of tree cover. And these are worryingly in the Kenyan highlands, which have important patches of evergreen forests. And some of these losses also occur in the coastal regions. And when we look at SSP2, you in fact see a slightly larger set of losses of tree cover within the Kenyan highlands, but some of these losses are offset by lowered losses along these coastlines. So the idea behind showing you these plots is basically to show that under these 2 different futures, where forest losses or tree cover losses will occur are a little different, and the extent of these losses also vary in these 2 scenarios. But overall, if you look at the entire country as a whole, the losses are more or less, the changes are more or less similar. About 17% of the forested areas that were identified based on the AfriCover data set, 17% of those polygons are marked by declines in tree cover, whereas 83% remain stable between 2020 and 2050. But if you were to tally the overall losses and gain of tree cover, you see a net increase in tree cover by the end of 2050 under both of these scenarios. Now, if we look at these gains and losses of tree cover in conjunction with how human populations are going to change, it presents a slightly more complex picture. So here these maps show how the fraction of population that is urbanized changes under the different socioeconomic pathways. So under SSP1, you actually see, as is predicted by that storyline, large increases in the fraction of urbanized populations. And again, these increases primarily occur in the sort of western portions of Kenya, where important evergreen patches persist to date. And whereas in SSP2, whereas the urbanization isn't as intense, this is a scenario where the overall population size is higher. So there is a larger increase in population here in this scenario, but a large fraction of that population is rural relative to the sustainable world that is described by SSP1. And so to summarize that, we see that population increase is, as I said, largest in SSP2, and the fraction of urbanized population is larger in SSP1. Now, relative to the historical period, when a mean fraction of 0.05 of the population was urbanized in these areas where forest cover exists, under SSP1 and SSP2, you see a substantial jump in the fraction of population that is urban. And so what these storylines also tell us is the nature of the urbanization. So under the sustainability scenario, we are talking about fairly controlled urban growth, whereas in SSP2, you're talking about some of the ways urban areas are expanding in our world today, which is sort of slow but highly iniquitous. And so to take these sort of diverse bits of information together, what we see today is that present-day afforestation efforts should account for possible losses to tree cover over the next 30 years resulting from climate change. So this idea that we could invest in afforestation efforts in areas where trees may not be viable in the future world on account of increasing temperatures and declines in precipitation. And some of these losses can be mitigated, for example, through the appropriate selection of tree species. So for example, in data that I've not shown here, but in just some preliminary testing, we see that deciduous trees do tend to perform better than evergreen trees. So if you were to afforest with deciduous trees in certain areas, they tend to not decline as rapidly as, say, evergreen tree cover would. And similarly, if tree cover expansion is sort of predicated on communities adopting and maintaining agroforestry practices, understanding the trajectories of urbanization in many of these areas where afforestation is to be implemented, it would be useful to know what sort of incentives might be needed to keep agroforestry profitable under a scenario of increasing or expanding urbanization. And some caveats, this is a sort of a preliminary exploration. So the data set that we use to describe the future climatic conditions come from a single climate model, which is not appropriate. It would be better to use an ensemble model. And the results here are presented for 2050, but if we were to change the time horizon to say 2070 or later, these trends will differ. So it's very important to sort of set, when we are talking about sustainable afforestation practices, it is important to keep in mind sort of timelines about over what time period are we thinking about achieving these and maintaining these goals. And finally, L-range is not the perfect tool to model forested areas. It's best suited for plant populations and rangelands, but it still does offer a useful way to characterize how trees will respond over large scales and larger time spans in the future. So with that, I'll say thank you.
Thank you, Reka. That was fantastic. A lot to think about there. And so now I will try and share my screen, which I did seamlessly before, which means it won't work now, right? Okay, so let's see here. How's that? Thumbs up? Looks okay? All right, thumbs up, good. Okay, so this work was conducted, I'm going to talk a little bit about something called the Human Footprint Index. And this is a global spatial measure of what's the pressure of humanity on the landscape. And I'm going to talk about a new way that we've developed over the last few years to kind of find a shortcut to how you can calculate this. This was done in collaboration with two colleagues, Elizabeth Barnes, happens to be my wife, and Neil Carter, who's at the University of Michigan. And this work was funded in part by NASA. So just some background. The Human Footprint Index is a global metric of the pressure of humanity on the landscape. Like, how much are we modifying the surface of the Earth? And this has been around for decades now at this point. And it is very widely used in the conservation, the biodiversity world, the community of practitioners and scientists thinking about the spread of people on the planet. This is a very widely used tool. So just as an example, a 2016 publication that provided maps of the HFI for 1993 and 2016 has been cited almost, I think at this point, it's almost 500 times. So it's a very widely used product. And it's not the only game in town, I should say. There are other teams of people. Dave Theobald has led other efforts to come up with parallel products that get at similar features of the Earth, similar measures of human pressure on the landscape. They come to slightly different conclusions and their methods are different. And so I just want to emphasize that the HFI is not the only game in town. It's a pretty dominant one, though. And this is what it looks like, or this is one way you could visualize it. So this is a global representation of the human pressure in 2000. And if you were a student in one of my classes, you should shoot your hand up and say, where's the legend? What am I looking at? You're absolutely right. So the dark purple colors correspond to more or less wild areas, pristine wilderness, or close to it. Places that have very low pressure. Now, it's not actually pristine if you look at some of those places, but very, very low human pressure. And then it goes through pink all the way up to yellow, indicating very high human pressure. Imagine like a paved over urban environment, as changed as we can make it. So why do we care? Again, we've got all sorts of reasons to care about understanding where and why people are changing the surface of the Earth. Everything from climate goals. So we're trying to understand how to mitigate carbon emissions, suck carbon out of the atmosphere. So that could mean afforestation in some places, similar to what Reiko was talking about. It could be related to the Sustainable Development Goals, so SDG 15, other aspects of development related to the Sustainable Development Goals. But there's a whole other slew of alphabet soup when it comes to different types of global indicators regarding kind of conservation and biodiversity conservation. And then you've also got sort of the science community that needs to simulate ecosystem modeling, species movement, species habitat. This gets used for all of those things, or it can be used for all those things. And you might say, okay, well, why do we need something? So we've got all these maps that are from maybe, 5, 7, 10 years ago. Why do we need something that's closer to it? Because that's really the advantage that a machine learning approach is going to give us, is it can give a faster update without having the laborious data collection process from the past. And part of the reason we would need something that's very up to date is development now, even in 2022, is happening faster and faster. The pace of development, the scale of change that can unfold in a matter of years is categorically different than what it used to be. We can go in and strip mine a mountain much more quickly and efficiently than we could 20 years ago, 30 years ago. It's possible to clear out a forest and drop in a palm oil plantation in a matter of years rather than a decade. Because of that, we need tools that allow us to monitor and keep pace with that scale of development, that pace of development. So historically, the approach has been to take a ton of data, so observations from surface observations from the ground, from the satellites, et cetera, combine that into a geographic information system in a computer, come up with a bunch of different ways to weight that data, how much we consider this or that, and then come up with a map. So this was done for the year 2000. And so another way to think about this is if you were to go to Google Maps and you turn on the satellite view, you can look at the image of the Earth and probably say, that's a street, that's a town, that's a forest. As a person, you can probably do that, not with very much training. So imagine a computer, a neural network, being able to be trained, instructed in how to classify the landscape. Just as I could train you to classify things very precisely, you can train a computer to do the same thing. And so what we did is we had a neural network learn what different aspects of the surface of the Earth look like, and then how they should be classified in terms of the pressure on the landscape. And we compared our machine learning version of this map for 2000 to the year 2000 sort of truth data, and it was pretty good. And we thought, now if we can do that, we can use the same neural network to interpret up-to-date satellite data from 2019, and then come up with a map, the most current map of the human footprint index that exists. So I'm not going to get into this right now. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer them in the, we just don't have time. This could be an hour long, probably a 2-hour long talk. We're not going to do that. And so what we used was a convolutional neural network. And it was, I believe, 6 layers deep. And essentially what this is we use these all the time. This is what your phone uses. This is what Facebook uses to identify features in an image and tell you what's in that image. There are lots of different kinds of neural networks out there. This particular kind is very good at recognizing and interpreting imagery. And just as a quick rundown, so if we start on the left-hand side, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but if we start here, you say, okay, well, this is what the truth of the human footprint index is for the year 2000 from the most recent product. We're now calling it the ml-HFI for the corresponding author's last name. This is what the HFI looks like. This is the satellite data for the exact same spot for the year 2000, and we get our neural network to guess something similar. Now we show our neural network satellite data for the year 2019, and a giant road has gone in there, so it better get a different answer. And sure enough, we get a different answer right here. And so that's very crudely the process of how we trained our neural network. We actually had 8 different sections of the planet, because the planet has lots of different features, not just geographic, like naturally occurring mountains, et cetera, but the way we crop, the way we plant food, for example, is very different. That pattern is different in different parts of the world. So we actually trained the model in different parts of the world, and we sort of optimized this based on computational efficiency and a few other things. And just as a side note, we only trained on 3% of the data. If you're a machine learning person, you'll know that that's a very small amount. And that was because we simply didn't have the computational power to do more. With bigger computers, more computer time, et cetera, we could probably train on substantially more and make improvements beyond what is already a pretty good model. So you might be wondering, okay, what the heck does this look like? So this is the year 2000, and then we can flash ahead to what we guessed for the year 2000 from the machine learning perspective. So just look at the image, and I'm going to click back and forth. So this is our version, so the ml-HFI 2000. This is the original, ours, the original. You might notice ours is a bit brighter. So we identify maybe a bit more development than the original. Some of that could be wrong. Some of that might actually be right. And this is 2019. So if we compare 2019 to the year 2000, I'll go back and forth. 2019, 2000, 2019. 2000, you can start to see different parts of the world kind of lighting up. Eastern China in particular lit up, and that's not an artifact. That amount of transformation took place in the last 20 years. If you're wondering what the error is, like how close are we? how good is this? This is a way of saying if we allow our error to go, are we 0.1 off, 0.2 off from the original data, 1%, 2%, or 10%, 20% wrong? This is a way to represent that. Essentially, if you allow a tolerance of being off by about 0.2, then we get to about 97% accuracy. And again, this is sort of a pilot project, first cut with only 3% of the data. And Libby, who led most of the machine learning stuff, she said this is remarkable from a machine learning perspective. So it's something to think about if we were to try and do this again, maybe get some stronger computers to improve this a bit. But just as an example, what does this look like? So let's look at Mexico City. So the Landsat image, so Mexico City and Botswana mining installation. So the top row marching across from left to right, we've got the Landsat imagery. This is what the original guess is for 2000. And this is what we guess. We get the distribution, we get the pattern pretty closely. We don't privilege roads in quite the same way that the Williams HFI product does, so we don't see that signature, but the overall pattern is very close. And with this Botswana mining installation, we see right here, this is their guess, and then this is ours. And I shouldn't say their guess, we're treating their data as truth, more or less, at least from a training perspective. And that's, by the way, this is overwhelmingly the story. There's very good agreement, like I just showed you in terms of the error. However, there are some places where it does get it wrong, particularly in deserts and very steep mountain ranges. So for example, in this Australian desert, The Williams-HFI says there's nothing there. And the ml-HFI thinks there's a little bit of something. And I've looked very closely at a lot of this imagery, and there is indeed nothing there in most of these. So for Saudi Arabia, this is very wrong. And if you look closely, a lot of this looks like roads, actually. This patterns in this desert look quite a bit like roads. And so this is something, again, where if we had more training data, this could probably be substantially improved because we know where we're wrong. We have a target of where we need to improve. Weirdly enough, there might be some places where we actually do a bit better. You might be like, how can you do better? Well, we're only training on 3% of the data. That means we're guessing 97% of the rest of the planet. So what we learn, what the machine learns for those 3%, it's then extrapolating and guessing. So there might be places now where it guesses correctly in a way that the original data doesn't represent it that way. What do I mean? This is a totally transformed agricultural landscape in Venezuela. So this is what the Williams-HFI has there, which is very low. And then this is what we guess, which is probably more characteristic of a transformed agricultural landscape. Similarly, this is an artisanal mining area in Indonesia. And we see that there's very low HFI here for the year 2000 and substantially higher here. And actually, I had no idea. I couldn't tell if this was natural or not. So I had to go on Street View and Google Street View, and I drove around looking at what this landscape looked like, and I still had no idea. So then I had to go to local news in this part of Borneo to understand, and then use Google Translate to understand. And this is artisanal gold mining that's taking place. So there was a lot of kind of labor-intensive QA, quality assurance, on my part to make sure that the results that we found, we understood and why. I'm not going to go into this too much. There's a huge push now in AI and machine learning research to come up with explainable methods. How do you know you're getting the answer? What is the method? Opening up that black box. And there's now some exciting tools. Just to zoom ahead, this is an example where the neural network is telling us, we have a tool called layer-wise relevance propagation, ask me about it later, that allows us to see what the neural network is paying attention to in this Landsat imagery. How is it making a determination that human footprint is actually going up? Well, in this particular image for this new Landsat image, we see it's going from a farm to a big road. And indeed, the neural network is actually paying attention to this big road going in. It means it's making the decision for the right reason, not some noisy, random process. Okay, Sustainable Development Goals. That's why we're here in the first place. So why are we talking about the Human Footprint Index in the context of SDG 15? I don't need to dwell on this too much. We've already talked about it. This is sort of like the layer cake representation of the SDGs with the biosphere forming the foundation. When it comes to SDG 15 or any of these indicators that are spatially extensive, it really matters to understand where are things changing and how. Now, this doesn't necessarily get at the how part, but it definitely gets at the where. And if we can have an up-to-date metric, it allows us to provide a backstop, a data-informed backstop to understand where are changes happening. In some cases, if we had year-to-year data, we could say maybe where's explosive change happening that could be problematic. So what we did is we looked at all of the countries globally from the most recent report in 2020 to say which countries are making progress towards SDG 15. So that means they are either making progress or on track for achievement by 2030. And each country has slightly different goals and metrics by which they're doing that, because each country is on a different rung of this sort of development ladder, you could say. And there were 43 countries that are nominally making progress towards SDG 15 and also experiencing substantial increases in human pressure. All right, this should be a contradiction in your mind. How can a country that's making progress towards biodiversity conservation, stopping forest deforestation, et cetera, make progress or be expanding in their development? So we wanted to unpack this, try and look at how this actually is working. So we zoomed in on these 8 countries here. We've got, what have we got? Uganda, Suriname, Guyana, Slovenia, Estonia, Morocco, Benin, and the Gambia. And what we see is this, the orange is the spatial pattern of development. And then the little icons indicate what particular aspect of SDG 15 are they on track or making progress toward. This is just a visual way to show that. We actually dove into 3 countries' policies that are actually, and I say dove into, there's a paper about this, to understand like what's the story here. And long story short, it's complicated because each country is different. Morocco is focused on enforcement of forest boundaries, regulations, et cetera, actually coming up with different kinds of cartography to improve its achievement of SDG 15. The Gambia is focused on an entirely different set of issues. In fact, this development is taking place at the mouth of this river. whereas a lot of the conservation is taking place upriver. And so there's sort of like, you can have development in one place and then conservation in another. So there's different routes that these different countries are taking. So long story short, though, what I want to say is that the machine learning tools are sort of in an infancy when it comes to applications for supporting sustainable development. There's a couple of different products that are out there talking about using different types of AI and machine learning to understand, disaggregate global economic and even national economic data to get a better sense of where are pockets of poverty changing. And then if we can come up with more tools to sort of support anticipatory governance when it comes to SDGs, anticipatory regulation, that sort of thing, can help us to understand where might we expect sort of these explosive changes. And it's not necessarily the fault of, say, a central government. It could be the fault of regulatory capture, where you have a set of companies, private enterprises, that are able to essentially secure the ability to change a landscape that is maybe against the will of the broader public. So this isn't meant to be like, a hammer against countries that aren't making progress, but development unfolds for lots of reasons, and this can help support that, sort of a backstop and make sure we understand why and where development is happening. So I want to make sure that this is available, so you can download the data, you can download the neural network architecture if that's your jam, and you can play around with this. And we also have a paper that's published right here. So go ahead and email. There's my email, a bunch of other stuff. You can get a hold of me. Just shoot me an email if you want to get a copy of the paper or know where to go, or if you have questions that we can't cover in these last few minutes that we have. Thank you.
This has been such a wonderful conversation. We've got 3 minutes left in this session. So if there are any questions, let's do that now before I wrap up. Looks like there's one in the chat. For any panelists, what aspects can you bring back to the US to help us meet SDGs?
I can jump in real quick there. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So one of the things that we found with this machine learning human footprint index is you can actually see between 2000 and 2019 the dramatic changes in, for example, North Dakota fracking. So like the fracking infrastructure that went in, you can see like a brightening of that part of North Dakota and sort of that part of the country, which is associated with substantial fossil fuel infrastructure going in, which would not be supportive of achieving the SDGs domestically in the United States. On the flip side, you can actually see the number of wind farms going in parts of Texas totally expanding. And so when I was looking at this sort of and zooming in and understanding what are the processes unfolding, there are these complicated stories that can be revealed. And in the US, at least, it helps us to understand, well, there are parts of the country that are maybe, I won't say part of the problem, but not necessarily reinforcing our achievement of SDGs domestically. And there are actually parts of the country that are sort of reinforcing that. And understanding what's happening, what's driving those socioeconomically from a policy perspective, that could help, I think. And so at least the ml-HFI could probably make some contribution. Now, I don't know how we get that on the table of somebody who matters, but.
Thank you so much. There's one more question in the chat, but we're out of time. So maybe we can follow up with that one offline. I want to take a moment to thank all of our presenters today. Like, what an incredible talk. I really learned a lot, and I'm so interested and excited to see your work progress. So thanks to all of our panelists again, or thank you to all of our attendees. We will have a short survey that you can fill out as the session ends. And our next session will be beginning at noon, and that is educational efforts designed to promote student involvement in international trade. So hope to see you there. And then our keynote speaker for today will be at 1 p.m. and that's Lulu Garcia Navarro. So I hope to see folks at that session as well. I'm really, really excited for that one. So thank you for your participation. Hopefully we'll be able to do this in person again in the future. And again, thank you everyone for your time. Have a great rest of your afternoon.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Yeah, bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.